It was a freezing winter night, and Elena's hands were trembling as she hugged her thin coat closer to her body, her breath forming small clouds in the icy air. She had just finished her double shift at the diner, exhausted beyond words, her feet aching from standing all day. But there was no time to complain. Life had never been kind to her, and tonight was no different. Her phone screen was cracked, barely functioning, but she had managed to book a cheap ride home, or so she thought. As she stepped onto the curb, scanning the street for her ride, a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up in front of her, its headlights casting an almost heavenly glow in the dimly lit street. She frowned. That couldn't be her Uber, could it? The driver, dressed in an immaculate black suit, stepped out and gave her a polite nod before opening the door for her. Maybe she had luck on her side for once. Maybe the app had glitched and sent her something luxurious for a change. Without thinking twice, she slid into the back seat, sighing in relief as the warm interior embraced her frozen skin. The scent of rich leather and something distinctly expensive filled her lungs, making her momentarily forget the harsh reality of her life. Finally, she mumbled to herself, stretching her sore legs. But the moment was short-lived. A deep, authoritative voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Who the hell are you?" Elena's heart nearly jumped out of her chest. She turned her head sharply and found herself face to face with a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a Forbes magazine. He was sitting there, dressed in an elegant three-piece suit, his sharp jawline clenched in irritation, and his piercing blue eyes scanning her like she was an insect that had invaded his personal space. She froze, her brain short-circuiting. Oh no. Oh no. This wasn't her Uber. This was someone's private car. Her throat went dry as she struggled to find words, her fingers gripping her worn-out bag as if it could somehow save her. I thought this was my ride," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man narrowed his eyes, his gaze dripping with disbelief and annoyance. "Do I look like a damn Uber driver to you?" His voice was cold, laced with the kind of authority that made people cower. Heat rushed to Elena's cheeks as embarrassment crawled over her skin. This was bad. This was really bad. She had just barged into a millionaire's car like an absolute idiot. "I'm so sorry," she blurted out, scrambling to reach for the door handle, but before she could escape, the car jerked forward, making her yelp in surprise. "Drive," the man ordered, ignoring her panicked expression. The driver obeyed without hesitation. Elena's breath hitched. "Wait!" "No, let me out," she pleaded, twisting in her seat. But the billionaire beside her didn't even blink. "You thought this was your ride?" His lips curved into a smirk, one that sent a chill down her spine. "Fine. Let's see if you can handle where it takes you." And just like that, her life was about to change forever. Elena had never known what peace felt like, not even for a second. Because her life had been a constant battle against poverty, pain, and the cruel indifference of a world that seemed to forget she existed. And as the luxury car drove deeper into the heart of the city, her mind drifted back to the shadows she had crawled out of. Memories she never wanted to revisit, but that clung to her like scars etched on her soul, starting with a childhood filled with broken promises and empty refrigerators, her mother working 3 jobs, and still barely managing to keep the lights on while her father vanished without a word when Elena was only 8, leaving behind nothing but overdue bills and a silent house that echoed with fear and hunger. And as she grew up, she learned quickly that dreaming was a luxury she couldn't afford. Because every time she closed her eyes, reality would snap back like a whip, reminding her that there was no fairy godmother coming, no magical escape from the small, decaying apartment where the walls bled dampness and the nights were filled with the sounds of neighbors fighting or sirens wailing in the distance, and yet she kept going. School by day, working tables by night, faking smiles for tips that barely covered her bus fare. But she had grit, the kind that doesn't sparkle but holds people together when everything else falls apart. And even though college had been a dream she nurtured like a fragile candle, it was snuffed out the moment her mother fell sick, and she had to choose between tuition or medication. And of course, she chose her mother, watching her fade away slowly as the hospital bills mounted, and the world outside kept spinning like her pain didn't matter. And when she died, Elena didn't even have the luxury to grieve properly, burying her emotions under an avalanche of shifts, debts, and survival instincts that turned her into someone who didn't cry anymore because tears didn't pay the rent. And yet somewhere inside, she held on to a tiny shred of hope. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, life would give her a break someday. Not a miracle. Just a small window of relief. A moment to breathe. But instead what she got was more chaos. More nights spent sleeping on a friend's couch when she couldn't make rent. More humiliation when customers at the diner threw coins on the table like she was a beggar. More guilt when she saw her reflection and realized she couldn't remember the last time she smiled for real. And despite all that, she never let bitterness consume her. Never allowed herself to hate those who had what she didn't. Even when she served plates of gourmet food to people who wouldn't finish half of it, while she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. And even when the rich walked past her like she was invisible, she told herself that she was still worthy, still human, still enough. And maybe that was the reason fate decided to mess with her that night. Because she still believed in something better. Because she still dared to walk with dignity despite the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. And now as she sat beside a man who radiated wealth and power in a car that cost more than anything she could imagine, the contrast of her life and his felt so jarring it made her stomach twist, because he probably drank wine that cost more than her entire month's income. He probably vacationed in places she only saw on postcards while she worked 16 hours to afford a second-hand winter coat. And yet here they were, breathing the same air, occupying the same space, and for the first time she realized how loud poverty was. It screamed from her scraped knuckles, from her scuffed shoes, from the way she clutched her bag like it was the only thing she owned. While he sat there calm, cold, collected, like the chaos of the world never touched him. And she hated that it made her feel small, like she didn't belong, like she was intruding on a life that wasn't meant for people like her. But beneath all that discomfort was something else too, something wild and terrifying. A spark of curiosity, a flicker of rebellion. Because maybe this moment was a crack in the wall, a glitch in the universe, a chance to see what existed beyond the prison of her reality. And even though she didn't know who he was, or why he hadn't kicked her out yet, she could feel the shift, the invisible pull of two opposite worlds colliding. And somewhere deep in her chest, her heart whispered, what if? What if this wasn't just a mistake? What if this was the beginning of something that would finally rewrite her story? Elena sat frozen in the soft leather seat of the luxury car, her fingers clutching the strap of her worn-out purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her mind still struggling to process what had just happened. How a simple mistake of stepping into the wrong car, a billionaire's car no less, had turned into the most surreal evening of her life. And as she nervously glanced sideways at the man beside her, the same one who had watched her spiral into panic only moments ago and then simply laughed, she couldn't help but feel like she was being toyed with, but not in a cruel way. No. There was something else behind those intense, unreadable eyes of his. Something curious. Something calculating. And maybe even something amused. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and smooth like velvet, but carried the authority of someone who was used to people listening when he talked. You thought my Bentley was an Uber? He asked, a small smirk tugging at his lips. And Elena could only nod, cheeks burning with embarrassment, wishing the seat would just swallow her whole. But then came the moment she never could have seen coming, when instead of asking her to get out, instead of brushing her off or calling security, he asked her questions. Where was she going? Why was she in such a rush? What did she do? And before she could even finish telling him she worked at a downtown diner and was late for her third shift this week, he made the offer that would change the entire trajectory of her life. Quit your job, he said calmly, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. And she blinked at him like he'd just spoken another language. What? She whispered. Sure, she'd misheard. But he leaned in, not with arrogance but with a quiet certainty that was somehow more dangerous, more seductive. Come work for me, he said. And when she asked what exactly that meant, his response was simple yet baffling. "I need a personal assistant. Someone who's not from my world. Someone real." And Elena almost laughed in disbelief, thinking it was a joke, some kind of twisted social experiment. But he wasn't smiling anymore. His face serious now, focused. And though every logical bone in her body screamed that this was insane, that this man was a stranger, that nothing made sense, something deeper inside her stirred. A whisper of curiosity, of hope, of possibility. Because this wasn't just about a job. It was an escape hatch from a life she'd been barely surviving. And when she asked why her, out of everyone he could choose, he simply replied, "Because you didn't ask for anything, and that's rare in my world." And it wasn't until he handed her a business card with his private number and the name of his company, one she'd seen on the news, on magazines, one that screamed billions, that the reality began to sink in. And though she went home that night still dazed, still unsure if she'd imagined the whole thing, she found herself staring at that card like it held the keys to another dimension. And after a sleepless night and a shift that felt longer than her entire life, she found herself dialing the number, her fingers trembling. And when his voice came through, cool and confident, "I was wondering when you'd call." Everything shifted, and before she knew it, she was stepping into an entirely different world. Into a high-rise building with glass walls and marble floors, where people wore tailored suits and spoke in hushed tones and looked at her like she didn't belong. And maybe she didn't. But she was here. And her job began not with paperwork or orientation, but with him. A man who seemed to carry the weight of an empire on his shoulders and yet trusted a complete stranger with access to his schedule, his meetings, his private life. And though the others whispered, questioned her presence, wondered how someone with no degree, no pedigree, no connections had landed a position so close to the most untouchable man in the city, she kept her head down and did the one thing she'd always known how to do: work hard, stay invisible, learn fast. And as days turned into weeks, she found herself navigating a world of boardrooms, luxury jets, charity galas, and corporate warfare, all while still feeling like that same girl who once cried herself to sleep in a freezing apartment. And yet somehow, this man, cold, calculating, and famously unapproachable, kept pulling her further into his orbit, asking her opinion on million-dollar decisions, watching her reactions with unsettling interest, defending her when others doubted her. And slowly, dangerously, she began to wonder if this job was ever just about a resume, or if he had seen something in her that even she couldn't see yet. And just like that, the job offer that started as a mistake became the catalyst of a transformation. Not just in her career, but in the way she saw herself. And the deeper she fell into this world, the harder it became to separate survival from purpose, duty from desire, and professionalism from the growing tension that neither of them could ignore anymore. And as much as she told herself this was temporary, that she was just a placeholder until he found someone qualified, every time he looked at her with that strange flicker in his eyes, she couldn't help but wonder what exactly he saw, and if maybe, just maybe, her arrival in his life hadn't been a mistake at all, and completely out of character. Shook something loose inside both of them. But the tension didn't fade, it intensified. And in the days that followed, they danced around each other like flames flirting with gasoline, each moment crackling with potential and danger, until even their silences felt louder than words. And as the line between personal and professional blurred, the people around them began to notice. Whispers circulated, rivals plotted, and Dominic's inner circle grew restless, fearing that this unknown girl was changing their perfectly controlled boss, softening his edges, making him vulnerable, and that fear turned to sabotage, calculated and quiet at first, but soon ruthless, as powerful forces within Dominic's empire began pushing back, questioning Elena's influence, trying to push her out. And yet, despite everything, Dominic didn't waver, not publicly, not professionally, but with every challenge they faced, he leaned on her more, relied on her judgment, trusted her instincts, and while he never said it aloud, everyone could see it. The coldest man in the city had finally found someone who could reach him, and that made her a threat to the very world she was still struggling to navigate. But Elena wasn't afraid of threats, not anymore, because somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being just a girl with a mistake and a dream. She'd become someone who could stand toe-to-toe with billionaires. Not because she had their money, but because she had something they'd lost. Heart, fire, and fearlessness. And as Dominic watched her confront every challenge thrown her way with unshakable resolve, he realized the scariest thing wasn't losing control. It was the possibility that he might actually feel something real for the first time in years, something he couldn't buy, manipulate, or protect. And though neither of them said it, the war had already begun, not just with the enemies outside, but with the walls inside them both that were crumbling faster than either of them could stop. The shift wasn't loud or dramatic. It came quietly, like a late-night breeze slipping through the cracks of a tightly shut window. And yet it was powerful enough to leave a mark on Dominic Steele, the man everyone thought was incapable of being touched emotionally. And it all began with a single moment, a break in the chaos, when Elena found him not in his glass-walled office commanding an empire, but alone in the company's underground garage, sitting inside his sleek black Aston Martin with his head tilted back against the seat, eyes closed, hands clenched on the steering wheel like he was holding on to something invisible just to keep himself together. And for a second, she didn't say a word, just stood there, unsure if she should walk away or pretend she hadn't seen the coldest billionaire in New York look like he was seconds away from falling apart. But then he noticed her, his eyes opening slowly, guarded as always. But the damage was already done, because she'd seen through the mask, and instead of retreating, Elena did something no one had ever dared to do. She asked him, gently but firmly, "Are you okay?" And the silence that followed was heavier than any boardroom negotiation they'd ever had, until finally, with a voice that sounded nothing like the Dominic she knew, he said, "I buried my mother today." And the air between them shifted completely, because in that moment, he wasn't the billionaire CEO, he was a son in mourning, a man who had just lost the only person who had ever truly known him before he built his empire. And Elena didn't respond with empty words or corporate condolences. She simply walked over, opened the car door, and sat in the passenger seat beside him without asking. Just sat there, letting the silence say what words couldn't. And for the first time, Dominic didn't try to fill the space with orders or logic. He just sat with her, breathing in a calm he didn't know he needed. And slowly, pieces of his story slipped out. Not all at once, but in fragments, like he was testing her ability to carry his truth. And she listened, really listened, to the stories of how he'd grown up in a house filled with cold ambition and loud silence, where love was a transaction and failure was punished with absence, and how his mother had been the only light, the only softness in a world that demanded he be steel from a young age. And as he spoke, Elena's heart broke in places she didn't know existed. Not just for the boy he'd once been, but for the man he'd become. So guarded, so used to pretending, that even grief felt like a weakness he had to headland in that garage, surrounded by concrete and shadows. She reached over and placed her hand gently on his, not romantically, not dramatically, just human to human, as if to say, "You don't have to do this alone." And that simple touch unraveled something deep inside him, because for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to be invincible. And as the hours passed and the world outside kept spinning, they sat there in that silent cocoon, two souls from opposite worlds bound by something raw and real. And when they finally walked back upstairs, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Because from that day on, Dominic started looking at Elena differently, not with suspicion or irritation, but with quiet respect, and maybe even something deeper he wasn't ready to admit. And though he never spoke of that night again, the way he treated her shifted, subtly but undeniably, as if he'd decided she was no longer just a mistake that stumbled into his world, but someone who belonged there in ways no one else ever had. And Elena, too, felt the weight of that night ripple through her, because as much as she tried to keep things professional, the version of Dominic she'd seen, the broken, grieving man beneath the armor, had left an impression on her heart she couldn't shake, and she found herself caring, not because he was rich or powerful, but because she'd seen the good in him, the hurt, the honesty. And even though they went back to their routine, to meetings and deadlines and long hours, The tension between them shifted from cold resistance to simmering awareness. And every time their eyes met across a conference table or during late-night work sessions, there was a silent acknowledgement of that shared moment, a secret that no one else could see but was etched in the way he stood a little closer, spoke a little softer, and trusted her with decisions no one else got to make. And slowly, the people around them began to sense it too. The way he'd pause before shutting her down in meetings, the way he'd ask for her opinion in front of executives, the way he'd smile, barely but undeniably, when she made sarcastic remarks. And even though neither of them said anything out loud, the shift was undeniable. And one night, during a charity gala when Elena wore a dress she'd borrowed from a coworker just to fit in, Dominic caught sight of her across the ballroom and something in his expression cracked, just for a second, and when she walked past him, pretending not to notice, he leaned in and whispered, "You're the only one who looks like they belong." And that quiet confession stayed with her, echoed in her chest long after the music faded. And it wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something real. Something dangerous. Something that neither of them could afford and yet couldn't seem to stop. And that was the beginning of the unraveling. Not just of their defenses, but of everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Because no matter how hard they tried to keep their worlds separate, that one moment of vulnerability had built a bridge between them that neither time nor fear could tear down. It was supposed to be a simple corporate dinner, another night of smiling at strangers and pretending to belong in a room where chandeliers sparkled brighter than her entire wardrobe combined. And Elena had spent hours preparing, borrowing a dress from her kind neighbor, tying her hair with trembling fingers, and coaching herself in the mirror to smile no matter how out of place she felt. But what she didn't know was that this night would leave a scar so deep, it would shake her sense of worth to its core. Because while she stepped into that grand ballroom hoping to prove herself, others were waiting to remind her exactly where they thought she belonged. The whispers started early, subtle at first, a glance here, a smirk there. But Elena kept her head high until the moment the storm hit, and it wasn't from some stranger. It came from one of Dominic's oldest business partners, Veronica Lane, a woman with too much money and far too little grace, who spotted Elena standing beside Dominic during a toast and laughed so loudly it sliced through the room like a blade. "Oh, Dominic, I didn't know your company had started hiring Uber drivers," she said, the venom wrapped in velvet, and the entire room froze, turning to look at Elena like she was some accident they couldn't stop watching. And Dominic's hand, which had been holding his champagne glass, stiffened midair. But he said nothing. Nothing at all. And that silence was louder than any insult, because it told Elena that in that moment, she was utterly alone. And the laughter that followed wasn't just cruel. It was soul-crushing, and the worst part wasn't the comment, but the betrayal in Dominic's eyes, not because he joined in, but because he didn't stop it, didn't defend her, didn't reach for her hand or tell them to back off. He just let her drown. And as Elena stood there, her cheeks burning, her throat tight, her heart shattering, she realized this world she was trying so hard to survive in would never accept her, no matter how many late nights she worked or how many times she proved her worth. And with trembling hands, she placed her glass down and walked away. Not just from the table, but from everything, past the marble pillars, out of the glittering doors, and into the cold night, where tears finally spilled from her eyes because pride had held them back for too long. And in that lonely parking lot, where dreams often die, she broke down. The sobs racking her body like waves crashing on broken rocks, and no one came after her. Not even him. And that was the part that hurt the most, because a part of her had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Dominic saw her differently. Not as the poor girl who stumbled into his world, but as a woman worth standing up for. And yet when it truly mattered, when the wolves bared their teeth, he stayed silent. And silence can scream louder than any insult. And the next morning, she came to work like nothing had happened. Her face calm, her eyes guarded, her back straight. But everything inside her had changed. The sparkle had dimmed, the laughter was gone. And though Dominic tried to speak to her in passing, she gave him nothing but polite professionalism, because whatever unspoken bond they had been building shattered the moment he chose silence over decency. And the office felt different now. Colder, harder. And while everyone acted like they hadn't witnessed her humiliation, the glances lingered, the pity in their eyes cut deeper than the insult itself, and she buried herself in work, refusing to be seen as weak. But at night, when no one was watching, she'd sit alone in her tiny apartment and replay that moment on a loop, wondering how easily people could laugh at another's pain, and how effortless it was for the man she had started to trust to watch her fall, and not even flinch. But fate has a strange way of circling back, because 2 days later, Dominic showed up at her door, not with flowers or apologies, but with storm in his eyes, like he'd finally realized the depth of his silence. And he said, "Why didn't you return my calls?" And Elena, still hurting, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Because I don't answer to men who watch me bleed and look away." And for a moment, he didn't know what to say, because no one had ever spoken to him like that, with that kind of raw honesty. And she shut the door before he could reply. Not out of anger, but self-respect, because if he wanted her in his world, it had to be on equal footing, not as a charity case or someone he couldn't protect when the world turned cruel. And that night, Dominic didn't sleep, haunted not just by her words, but by the realization that in trying to keep his heart protected, he'd crushed the only person who had ever truly seen it. And from that point forward, something inside him shifted, because pain has a way of forcing growth, and Elena, though shattered, was no longer afraid of being broken. She'd survived humiliation, and from those ashes, a woman far stronger, far bolder was starting to rise. Dominic had built his empire by controlling everything, his business, his emotions, his image. But ever since that night, the control he prided himself on had slipped through his fingers like sand in a storm. Because while Elena tried to pretend nothing happened, her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken, and it haunted him, gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, disrupted board meetings, canceled dinners, and turned his penthouse into a cold, suffocating cage filled with regrets. Because for the first time in years, he saw himself through someone else's eyes, not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a coward who let a woman he cared about get torn apart while he said nothing. And it broke something inside him that had been locked away for so long. A version of himself he thought was buried under contracts and conference calls and control. And though he'd faced takeovers and lawsuits and betrayals, none of them cut like the look Elena gave him before she walked out of that ballroom. A look that screamed disappointment, not rage, and that disappointment became a mirror he couldn't escape. Not in the office, not at home. Not even in the gym where he used to bury his guilt in sweat and repetition. And every time he saw her, focused on her work, perfectly polite, painfully distant, he felt like a stranger in his own life. Because the fire in her eyes, the one that used to challenge him, question him, make him feel alive, was gone, and he missed it more than he missed sleep, more than he missed peace. Because she had somehow become the color in a world he didn't realize had turned grayscale. And now that she was fading, everything felt hollow. So he started watching. Not in a possessive way, but protectively, quietly. The way a man watches a sunrise he's afraid to miss again. And he noticed things he never paid attention to before. How she skipped lunch to meet deadlines. How she smiled at the janitor like he was the CEO. How her hands trembled when she was exhausted. But she never let the cracks show, and it crushed him. Because the girl who had the courage to correct him in front of the boardroom was now retreating behind walls she didn't deserve to rebuild, and he realized she wasn't just avoiding him. She was healing without him, growing stronger in the silence he had created. And that terrified him more than failure ever could. Because what if she didn't need him anymore? What if the damage was permanent? What if his inaction had cost him the one thing that made him feel human again? And so, he started doing things. Quiet things. Small things. The kind of gestures people miss unless they know what to look for. Her broken chair got replaced overnight. Her workload mysteriously lightened before big presentations. Her favorite coffee always happened to be in the break room when she arrived. And though he never took credit, she knew, deep down, that it was him. Because only someone who had truly paid attention would know how she liked her coffee. 1 sugar, no cream. And every act, though silent, whispered what his pride hadn't let him say. "I see you. I'm sorry. I'm trying." And for Elena, it was confusing, infuriating, and heartbreaking all at once, because she didn't want to fall for crumbs of affection or be swayed by half apologies wrapped in good intentions. But there was something undeniable in the way he looked at her now. Not as a man who wanted to possess her, but as someone who was afraid to lose her again, and it softened the part of her that still ached for him, even when logic told her not to. And the turning point came one rainy evening when her heel snapped in the parking lot, her bag fell, papers flying into puddles, and she just stood there, frozen, trying not to cry as cars splashed by. And out of nowhere, a jacket landed on her shoulders. His jacket. Warm, dry, expensive. And without a word, he knelt in the rain, gathering her papers like they were million-dollar contracts, his suit soaked, his pride forgotten. And when he finally looked up at her, raindrops clinging to his lashes, his voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm sorry I wasn't there when it mattered." And for the first time since that night, she saw the man beneath the billionaire, the boy who never learned how to say sorry, the man who built walls not to keep people out, but to keep himself safe. And something inside her shifted, because apologies wrapped in vulnerability are louder than 1,000 excuses. And as he walked her to her car, neither of them said much, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was healing. And in the days that followed, things began to change. Not drastically, not in movie-like confessions or public declarations, but in the quiet moments. Shared glances in meetings, the way he lingered just a second longer in elevators, how his smile softened whenever she spoke. And though she didn't let him back in completely, she stopped pushing him away. And that was enough. For now. Because sometimes the most powerful love stories aren't born from grand gestures, but from the courage to face your own failures and still choose to show up, again and again. And as the distance between them slowly faded, replaced by cautious trust and unspoken forgiveness, the foundation of something real began to form. Not built on money or pity or apology, but on the raw, imperfect truth of two people learning how to love without armor. And Dominic, once a man who never let anyone in, now found himself craving her presence more than power. And Elena, once a woman who thought pain was her only companion, now found herself believing that maybe, just maybe, people could change if they were willing to bleed for it. Just when Elena had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something real growing between her and Dominic. Something fragile but worth holding on to, like a flower blooming in the cracks of a broken sidewalk. Everything came crashing down with one brutal truth she never saw coming. A betrayal so sharp it didn't just hurt, it gutted her. And the worst part was, it wasn't whispered by a jealous co-worker or stumbled upon through office gossip. No, it came wrapped in laughter. In the cruel smirk of a rival who'd always hated her presence, delivered like poison in a wine glass at a corporate gala. She almost didn't attend, because somewhere in her heart she still feared the spotlight, feared being seen with him again. But he had asked, not with words, but with eyes that pleaded. And against her better judgment, she went, dressed in grace, walking into a room that would shatter her all over again. Because while Dominic was across the room shaking hands with foreign investors, Elena was cornered by Madison, the icy, manipulative ex who had once been engaged to Dominic before he shattered that relationship to pieces. And with a venomous smile, she leaned in close and whispered a sentence that detonated everything Elena thought she knew. "You really think he chose you over a merger? Sweetheart, you were the distraction. He closed a billion-dollar deal the night after your little breakup scene." And Elena laughed at first, because it sounded absurd. But then Madison pulled out her phone, showed her the timeline, the photos, the press releases, and suddenly the puzzle pieces began rearranging themselves in her mind. The secret meetings, the sudden disappearances, the tension in his voice when she tried to talk about them, and like a curtain being pulled back, the truth emerged. She had been a pawn. A well-timed story, the poor girl turned corporate Cinderella who made him look softer, more human, more investable. And the betrayal wasn't just that he didn't tell her. It was that she had believed him, trusted him with pieces of her that no one else had touched. And now it all felt like a stage, a perfectly crafted illusion with her heart as the collateral. And while Madison walked away smug and satisfied, Dominic was still smiling across the room, completely unaware that the girl who once softened him was now burning inside with a rage so quiet it felt nuclear. And she didn't scream, didn't make a scene. No, Elena was done being the girl who broke down in public, so she walked out with dignity, heels clicking on marble like war drums, while Dominic finally noticed her leaving, confusion flashing in his eyes as he tried to cut through the crowd. But he was too late, because when he reached the lobby, she was gone. And with her went every chance he had of redemption, because she wasn't just hurt. She felt used, discarded, played. And as she sat in the back of a cab staring out at the city lights, her mind replayed every moment they shared. His words, his glances, his silences, and realized the one thing she feared the most had come true. She had loved him, and he had seen that love and weaponized it, whether intentionally or not. And now she was left holding the shards of something that was never real to begin with. And the worst part, a tiny voice inside her still wanted to believe him, still wanted to hear his side, still prayed for a version of the story where he wasn't the villain. But that voice was silenced by the screams of her dignity, because no deal, no dollar, no damage control should ever come at the cost of someone's heart. And when she got home, she didn't cry. Not yet. She opened her laptop, typed her resignation, closed the chapter without a single dramatic word, and by morning, she was gone. No trace left behind except the echo of someone who once believed in the impossible. And while Dominic read her resignation, his world stopped. Not because she left, but because he didn't know why, didn't understand what had triggered the storm. And as he called her phone and got nothing, searched her desk and found it empty, it began to dawn on him that something had happened. Something dark, something irreversible, and for the first time, he felt true fear. Not the kind that comes from losing money, but the kind that comes from realizing you broke the one person who made you better, and no amount of money could fix what was now broken beyond repair. And while he tried to trace back the hours, the moments, to find what he'd missed, Elena sat in a cafe across the city, phone off, heart numb, soul empty, staring at strangers laughing like she used to, wondering how long it would take to stop feeling like a fool, and telling herself over and over that she'd never let someone close again. Never believe in fairy tales wrapped in billion-dollar suits. Never again trust the smile of a man who says everything right but hides 100 secrets in the spaces between his words. And though her heart was shattered, her resolve was steel, because betrayal doesn't just end love, it buries it. And now the girl who once danced in hope was learning how to walk through fire. Dominic had faced boardrooms filled with cutthroat investors, had outmaneuvered hostile takeovers, and had stood unshaken while entire empires crumbled around him. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the deafening silence of Elena's absence, because her leaving didn't just sting, it dismantled him, piece by brutal piece. And the terrifying part wasn't that she was gone, it was that he didn't know how or why, didn't know the exact moment he crossed a line so unforgivable that she didn't even give him a chance to explain. And for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, he panicked. Not the performative kind, but raw, unfiltered desperation. The kind that made him abandon meetings mid-sentence, ignore calls from international clients, and storm through the company halls demanding answers, hoping someone, anyone, knew where she was. And when his assistant nervously handed him Elena's resignation letter, he read it a dozen times, hoping it might hold some clue. But it was clean, cold, professional, and that terrified him more than an angry goodbye ever could, because it meant she had shut down, emotionally severed. And as the hours turned into days, Dominic spiraled, chasing leads, reviewing security footage, calling every driver, assistant, and mutual contact they'd ever shared, replaying every conversation, every glance, every kiss, trying to figure out when the air shifted between them. And then, finally, it hit him. A whisper from the past, a name he hadn't thought about in weeks. Madison, and it only took one phone call to confirm what he feared. Madison had been at the gala, had cornered Elena, had twisted the truth into a dagger and stabbed her exactly where it hurt, and Dominic's fury was volcanic. But beneath the rage burned something deeper. Guilt, because he had kept secrets, had made her feel like an outsider in a world she was trying to understand. And maybe Madison hadn't lied. Maybe she just connected the dots he left unguarded. And now Elena was gone, believing she was nothing more than a chess piece in his billion-dollar game. And he couldn't live with that, not for one more day. So he did the one thing he never thought he would. He left the tower, the boardroom, the throne he'd built, and went searching not as a CEO but as a man who'd lost something real, something rare, and city after city, lead after lead, turned cold, until finally, by sheer miracle or fate, he found her. Not in some grand mansion or luxury suite, but working in a quiet bookstore tucked between forgotten streets, sleeves rolled, hair tied, eyes dulled, and when he saw her, something broke inside him. Because this wasn't just distance, it was damage. And as he stepped forward, she froze, their eyes meeting like a collision of old wounds. And he tried to speak, but she turned, walked to the back, and he followed, not caring who watched, not caring how undignified he looked, begging her. Not with flowers, not with apologies, but with truth, raw and bleeding, telling her everything. From the deal he never let influence his feelings, to the moment he realized she was more than a distraction. She was the reason he wanted to build a life beyond the boardroom. But she stared at him like a stranger, silent, tired, and asked just one question. Was I ever real to you, or was I just another negotiation? And his throat closed, because he could feel the weight of her pain in every syllable, and he wanted to scream that she was everything. But the words sounded hollow now, and she looked away, whispering, "You broke something in me, Dominic. Something I don't know how to fix." And he knew this wasn't the moment for grand gestures or dramatic speeches. This was the consequence of a man who thought love could wait until he had his empire secured. And now, he stood there, a king without a kingdom, offering nothing but a heart too late. And as he left that bookstore, hands shaking, he made a decision. Not to chase her again, but to prove, every single day, that what they had wasn't a story for investors or headlines. It was real, messy, flawed, and worth rebuilding. And while Elena locked the door behind him, her heart cracked a little more, because despite everything, part of her still wanted to believe him, still wanted to run after him. But she didn't, not yet. Because healing isn't instant, trust isn't magic, and sometimes even love has to bleed before it blooms again. Dominic had always believed that control was the only way to survive in a world that devoured the weak, that emotions were liabilities best buried beneath strategy and silence. But now, as he sat in the back of his car, parked outside that tiny bookstore like a lost child, everything inside him collapsed. And it wasn't quiet. It was suffocating, chaotic, violent. Because every image of Elena, laughing, crying, walking away, hit him like a wave he could no longer outrun. And the weight of it all became too much, crashing down in one raw, unfiltered moment of devastation, where he slammed his fists against the dashboard, chest heaving, eyes burning, and for the first time in his life, he cried. Not the silent, dignified kind, but the desperate, gut-wrenching kind that came from years of swallowing pain and pretending it didn't matter, because it had always mattered. She had always mattered. And now that she was gone, he realized he'd never told her, not really, how deeply, irreversibly she had changed him, how she made his billion-dollar world feel like it finally had color, sound, warmth. And as he whispered her name into the emptiness, his driver watched silently, unsure whether to say something or let the man who ruled boardrooms fall apart without witnesses. And Dominic couldn't take it anymore, couldn't breathe under the weight of his own silence. So he told the driver to go and stormed back into that bookstore like a man on fire, heart racing, palms sweating. And when he saw her behind the counter, casually talking to a customer, the contrast broke him even more. Because she had moved on, adapted, survived. And he had been spiraling in her absence like a man exiled from the only truth he had ever known. And the moment their eyes met, the world narrowed, time stilled. And he didn't wait for her to speak, didn't care if there were people around. He walked straight to her, grabbed her gently but firmly by the hand, and with a voice that cracked under the pressure of suppressed emotions, he said, "I need you to listen, not because I deserve it, but because if I don't say this now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." And she blinked, surprised, unsure, torn between walking away and standing her ground. But she nodded, barely. And in that fragile permission, Dominic broke open, spilling truths he had never said out loud, confessing how every single moment without her had felt like punishment, how he had rehearsed 1,000 versions of this conversation, but none of them captured what he truly felt. Because this wasn't about saying sorry. It was about telling her that loving her had dismantled everything he thought he was. That she made him want to be more than just rich or powerful. She made him want to be worthy, and Elena just stood there, silent, eyes wide, heart thudding, trying to process the avalanche of words that poured from the man who had once been a fortress of steel. And when he said, "I was never afraid of losing deals, losing control, but I was terrified of losing you. So I pushed you away before you could walk away, and I hate myself for it." Something inside her shifted, because she had waited so long to hear this, waited so long to feel like she wasn't crazy for thinking there was something deeper beneath his cold exterior. And while 1,000 questions still burned inside her, 1,000 wounds still throbbed, she saw him, really saw him. Not as the billionaire everyone feared, but as a broken man who was finally brave enough to be honest. And just as she opened her mouth to respond, a voice from the door interrupted. A woman, elegant and sharp, calling his name, and both turned to see Madison standing there smirking, her presence like poison in the air, and the moment shattered, tension thickening again. But Dominic didn't flinch, didn't even look at Madison. Instead, he kept his eyes on Elena and said, "She doesn't matter. Not anymore. Not ever again." And Madison's smirk faded into confusion, then fury, and she turned to leave. But the damage was already done. The bubble had popped. Reality had returned. And Elena, blinking back tears, whispered, "Why now?" And Dominic stepped closer, gently cupping her face, voice shaking as he said, "Because I'm not afraid anymore. Because I'd rather be rejected with honesty than live a lie without you. Because you're the only thing in my life I didn't earn. I was gifted and I threw it away." And in that moment, Elena's defenses trembled. Her heart caught between pain and the unbearable desire to believe him. And even though she didn't answer, didn't say the words he desperately needed, she didn't pull away, didn't walk off. And sometimes, that's all hope needs to survive. Just one moment of hesitation in the storm of hurt. One crack in the armor of goodbye, and Dominic clung to that crack like a man who had nothing else. Because now, everything depended on what came next. Elena didn't sleep that night. Her mind a whirlwind of everything Dominic had said, everything he had done, and everything he had failed to do, because no matter how raw and honest his confession had been, the scars he left behind still ached like fresh wounds. Her heart didn't know whether to surrender or shield itself. So she sat alone by her window, watching the early morning light bleed through the sky, wondering if love was really worth the risk again. And just as the sun began to rise, a black car pulled up outside the bookstore again, the same way it had the first time. But this time it wasn't a mistake. This time it was a deliberate choice. And when the door opened and Dominic stepped out in a plain black coat, no entourage, no show of power, just him, stripped of ego with nothing but hope in his eyes, Elena felt her breath catch. He walked up to her as she stepped out of the store, her arms folded across her chest, not in anger but in fear and self-protection. And he said, "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I broke something sacred between us. But if I could give you my heart in your hands right now and swear I'd never take it back, would you even want it?" And before she could answer, he reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to her, his fingers trembling. She opened it slowly and found papers not of money or business but a legal document declaring he was stepping down temporarily from his CEO position, transferring full control to his board, taking a leave from everything that once defined him, and her eyes shot up in disbelief. But he continued, before she could speak. I spent my whole life chasing control, power, success, thinking if I had enough money, no one could ever hurt me again. But then you came and showed me that vulnerability is not weakness, it's strength, and I can't love you and still live in that world I built to keep people out, so I'm burning it down for you. Not because I'm asking you to forgive me, but because I want to become the kind of man you can respect again. And Elena stared at him, stunned, shaken, because for the first time in her life, someone was choosing her above everything, above legacy, pride, wealth. And that terrified her more than anything, because it made the stakes real, and she didn't know if she could bear the weight of being someone's everything again. And she whispered, and what if I say no? What if I can't go back? And he stepped closer, eyes locked into hers, and said, then I'll still walk away, knowing I finally did the right thing for once. Because this isn't a game, Elena. This is me choosing love over power. And you're the only thing I've ever truly wanted. And her voice cracked when she said, but what if you change your mind again? And he shook his head and said, I already have. I changed the day I watched you walk away, and realized I'd never see that fire in your eyes again if I stayed the man I was. And in that moment she saw it not just in his words, but in his face. The way his voice trembled, not from nerves, but from truth. From the terrifying realization that this was his last shot, and she felt a lump rise in her throat because everything inside her wanted to believe him, wanted to fall into his arms and forget the pain. But the scars screamed louder. And she said, I need time. Not because I don't care, but because I care too much. And he nodded, not defeated, but understanding, and handed her a second envelope, this time smaller. And he said, there's a flight booked under your name, first class, to anywhere you want to go. No strings attached. Whether you want to disappear or just breathe, it's yours. And I won't call. I won't follow. But if you ever decide you want me, I'll be waiting. Not as the CEO. Not as the man who hurt you, but as someone who loves you with no expectations. And she opened it and saw the ticket and the handwritten note inside that simply said, your freedom, your choice always. And when he turned to leave, not looking back, her knees almost buckled. Because that was the moment she realized love wasn't about grand speeches or expensive gifts. It was about the willingness to let go if it meant the other person could heal. And for the next few days, Elena disappeared. She turned off her phone, left the bookstore in the hands of her best friend, and vanished into a coastal town hours away. Walking along empty beaches with nothing but the sound of her own thoughts, and somewhere between the silence and the waves, she found clarity, not perfection, not certainty, but enough truth to recognize that real love doesn't come wrapped in promises. It comes in tests and how people rise through them. And on the 5th morning she sat with the envelope he gave her, holding the ticket in one hand and her heart in the other, knowing that her next move would define not just her future, but his. And as she stood up, the wind whispered a name, not in guilt, not in pain, but in hope, and she knew what she had to do. Elena arrived back in the city with her heart pounding like a war drum. Unsure if she was too late, uncertain if the moment had already passed. Unsure if her silence had shattered the last thread between them. But something inside her stronger than fear pushed her forward, and when she reached Dominic's penthouse building she didn't hesitate. She stormed past the front desk straight into the elevator and punched in the floor number with trembling fingers. When the doors opened to his apartment she expected resistance, hesitation, perhaps even coldness. Still, instead she found chaos, boxes stacked along the hallway, shelves, cleared walls empty, and Dominic standing in the middle of the room with a suitcase open and his face a battlefield of unresolved pain and shock. And when he saw her, it was as if the world paused. He whispered, Elena, like her name was a prayer he hadn't dared to say aloud. She stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion, but her eyes blazing with truth. Why are you packing? And he looked down, avoiding her gaze, saying quietly, I meant what I said. I didn't want to wait around, hoping for something you weren't ready to give. so I figured I'd start over somewhere else, and she dropped the envelope she was holding on the table and said, "I read your note. I took your ticket, but I didn't run. I needed space, not distance, and I went to find out if what I feel for you is real, or just the shadow of desperation, and you know what I found? I found that no matter where I went, every single thing reminded me of you. Not the billionaire, not the boss, not the cold perfectionist, but the broken man who let himself be human with me, the man who finally fought for something other than himself." And he stared at her like he didn't dare believe it, and said softly, "Are you saying you came back for me?" And she nodded, tears brimming, "Because I've been fighting my whole life. Dominic, fighting to survive, to be seen to matter. But I've never had someone fight for me, and I've never fought for love until now. And if you're still willing to choose me even after everything, I'm not walking away." And that was all it took. The suitcase dropped from his hand, and he closed the distance between them. Like gravity pulled them together faster than thought. His arms wrapped around her as if letting go would kill him. And she buried her face in his chest, inhaling the scent she'd missed more than she would ever admit. And for the first time in weeks, there was no confusion, no battle, just surrender. And he held her like she was the one thing grounding him to this earth and whispered, "I'd give up my entire world for this moment." And she pulled back enough to look him in the eyes and said, "You already did, and that's why I'm here." And the kiss they shared wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce, desperate, full of all the words they hadn't dared to say. And when they broke apart, she asked softly, "What now?" And he smiled. Not the cocky CEO smirk, but a vulnerable, relieved smile, and said, "Now we stop fighting the world and start fighting for each other." And they spent the rest of that day unpacking the boxes. He never thought he'd open again. But this time, not as a man building a fortress around himself, but as someone building a life with someone else. And as the hours passed, their laughter returned, their hands brushed without hesitation, their eyes met without fear. And that night, as they lay together, tangled in silence and soft breaths, Dominic whispered one last confession. "I never believed in second chances until you gave me one." And she smiled against his chest and said, "I never believed in fairy tales until you became mine." And outside, the city kept rushing, the world kept spinning. But inside that room, time stood still, and for once, the fight wasn't about survival or ego or power. It was about love. The kind of love that isn't perfect, but is real, raw, earned, and worth every scar, every tear, every moment of terrifying vulnerability, because in a world built on illusions and power, the most radical act of all was simply choosing each other again and again and again. 3 weeks had passed since they chose each other again. But the city hadn't forgotten the storm that once surrounded Dominic Sinclair. The headlines had simmered down. The tabloids moved on. But in the corners of the billionaire world, whispers still lingered about the girl who had brought down the Iceman with nothing but her heart. And as the days turned into something like a new beginning, Elena found herself adjusting to a life that still didn't feel real, moving between charity events and corporate meetings, hand in hand with the man who once couldn't say her name without scowling. Yet somewhere inside her, a small voice wondered if this was real or just another calm before the storm. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Dominic had been planning something. A gesture not of wealth or status, but of soul. Something that would strip away everything the world believed about him and reveal the man. Only she had seen the man who didn't just fall in love, but was willing to prove it in front of the world. And so it happened one crisp morning when Elena walked into the art center. She volunteered at the place where she first found her voice and saw her purpose. She found it empty, eerily quiet. The kids gone, the staff missing, and in the center of the room was a path made of rose petals leading to the old theater hall. Her heart pounding, her breath caught in her chest. She followed it, unsure whether to smile or cry. And when she stepped into the theater, her breath stopped completely. Every seat was filled with faces from her past. The children from the shelter, her old roommates, her best friend, even Mrs. Carmichael, the woman who once called her nothing more than charity. And in the center, on the dimly lit stage, stood Dominic in a tuxedo with no security, no media. Just him holding a microphone with shaking fingers, and eyes that locked onto hers with such intensity, it made her knees weak, and he began speaking, his voice rough at first, but steady. I spent years hiding behind boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, believing emotions were liabilities, and love was a weakness. I never believed in grand gestures or happy endings. And then I met you, a woman who didn't ask for anything, but gave me everything. A woman who didn't fall for my status, but stayed for my scars. And he stepped closer, every word pulling her heart out of her chest, piece by piece. You made me laugh when I forgot how you made me feel, when I didn't know I could, and when I lost you. I learned the difference between loving someone and deserving them. I don't know if I deserve you, Elena, but I know I'll spend the rest of my life trying to. And then he turned to the audience and said, I once bought companies with a signature. Today, I want to do something harder. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and then sank to one knee, and the entire room gasped as Elena's hands flew to her mouth. Tears streaming down her face as he looked up and said, I don't care if we live in a penthouse or a shoebox. I don't care if the world accepts us or mocks us all. I care about is waking up every day, knowing I get to choose you. So Elena Rose Matthews, will you make the biggest decision of my life? And say yes. And for a second time stopped. The world vanished. And in that pause, every pain they'd endured, every wall they'd broken, every wound they'd bled together, all led to this. And through tears, through laughter, through complete disbelief, she nodded and whispered the word that shattered the last piece of the man who once feared love. Yes, and the audience erupted into applause. The children ran up throwing petals. The staff cheered and Dominic stood pulling her into a kiss that silenced everything else. And for the first time, this wasn't a love hidden in shadows or stolen in silence. This was a love claimed in public, proud, unashamed, and unstoppable. And as they held each other with the world watching, he leaned down and whispered, I never believed in fairy tales, but I will spend every day making ours come true. And she smiled through tears and whispered back, you already have. And in that moment, the girl who was once invisible, and the man who once felt untouchable, became a story not of wealth or power, but of heart, of healing, of choosing love when it's hardest and standing by it when it matters most. Because sometimes the grandest gestures aren't the ones filled with diamonds and fireworks. They're the ones that take everything you are and place it in the hands of the one person who never asked for more than your truth. The applause still echoed in the background. The scent of roses still lingered in the air. And yet the moment felt suspended in time, as Elena stood there in Dominic's arms, feeling the rawness of what had just unfolded. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next, because just when they thought they had faced it all, when love had seemingly conquered every barrier, life threw its final unexpected blow, and this time, it didn't come from a scandal or betrayal, but from a person they never thought they'd see again. Dominic's estranged mother, the woman he hadn't spoken to in years, entered the theater quietly. No one noticed at first. Not until her soft, gasping breath filled the silence that followed the final kiss. Her eyes welled up with tears. Not just for her son, but for the girl who had broken through his armor. The woman who brought him back from a lifetime of emotional exile. And as the crowd parted, she walked slowly toward them. Her expression unreadable. The weight of the past in every step. And for a second Dominic froze. The man who had conquered boardrooms and buried emotions now stood still like a child unsure of what to feel or say. And Elena felt it. The tremble in his grip, the shift in his breathing. And before he could speak, she squeezed his hand, stepped slightly forward and met the woman halfway with nothing but grace and gentleness. And what happened next was not just unexpected. It was the reunion of generations of silence mended by one single act of courage. Dominic's mother, with tears rolling down her cheeks, whispered, I've missed so many years, and I don't know if I have the right, but I came to see if there's still space in your life for a mother. And Dominic, this man who had endured a loveless upbringing, who had trained himself to feel nothing for so long, crumbled in that moment, not out of weakness, but out of overwhelming release, and he didn't speak. He simply walked forward and hugged her. The kind of hug that stripped away decades of pain and pride, and Elena stood back watching the man she loved find a part of himself he thought had died long ago, and the audience didn't move. No one dared to interrupt what felt like a sacred unraveling of past wounds being stitched together with raw honesty. And as mother and son stood there united for the first time in years, the room filled with quiet sobs from strangers who felt the weight of that moment like it belonged to them too. And just when the emotions had begun to settle, Dominic took the mic one more time, his voice shaking, but full of fire. There's one more thing I need to say, and it's not about proposals or money, it's about truth. Because for too long I let people define me by my wealth, by my company, by the walls I put up to survive. But today, I want to tell you who I really am. I am the son of a woman who sacrificed everything to raise me, even if I couldn't see it. Then I am the man who almost lost the only person who ever loved me for who I was, not what I had. And I am the partner of a woman who didn't just walk into my car by mistake. She walked into my life and gave it meaning. And then he turned to Elena again, and this time there were no rings, no gestures, just eyes that saw her soul. And he said, "I've done many things right and many wrong, but if I had to relive every mistake just to end up with you, I would. Because every road, every fall, every silence led me here to you." And the room felt like it had stopped breathing. The silence louder than any noise, the emotions too heavy to speak. And Elena, with trembling lips, eyes glistening in the soft lights, stepped into his arms and whispered, "Then let's stop surviving and start living." And as the crowd stood as one in a standing ovation, the two of them held each other not like a couple in a fairy tale, but like two broken hearts that had finally found home. And the people watching weren't just witnessing love, they were witnessing redemption. The kind of reunion that transcends romance and becomes something bigger. A declaration that love is not about perfection, but about showing up after the storms, when the world doubts, and still choosing each other. And in that moment, Elena and Dominic were not billionaire and poor girl, not broken man and fearless woman. They were just two souls that had found light in each other's darkness. And for everyone watching, it was more than a story. It was a reminder that the most powerful reunions are the ones that heal the past and pave the way for a future where love doesn't just win, it transforms. In the days that followed their emotional reunion, the world couldn't stop talking about them. News headlines flashed with titles like "The Billionaire Who Chose Love Over Power" and "From Uber Mistake to Ever After." The story spread like wildfire. But for Elena and Dominic, none of it mattered. Not the cameras, not the coverage, not the sudden swarm of curious strangers. What mattered was the quiet moments, the early mornings when he'd bring her coffee and trace his fingers along her cheek, the long walks in parks where they didn't need words to feel understood, the stolen kisses in kitchens, the silent tears wiped away with a single look, and the way they held each other like home was no longer a place, but a person. The world saw the fairy tale, but they lived the truth, a love forged in chaos, tested by betrayal, strengthened by pain, and crowned with forgiveness. Dominic sold one of his companies not out of necessity, but to reclaim his time, his peace, his presence in their relationship for the first time in years. He wasn't chasing profit, he was chasing purpose. And Elena, after so long, finally stood tall. Not as the girl who once lived paycheck to paycheck, but as a woman who built herself without shortcuts, without losing her soul. She started a foundation for women who had faced the kind of struggles she once knew too well, helping them rebuild, find careers, find dignity, because she never forgot where she came from, and she never wanted to forget. Love didn't change her, it amplified her, and Dominic never tried to rescue her. He simply stood beside her until she could rescue herself together. They redefined what love looked like. It wasn't grand mansions or first-class flights. It was apology texts at midnight, hands held during anxiety, filled mornings, forgiveness whispered when anger lingered too long, and laughter that made the past irrelevant. They weren't perfect, not even close. They still argued, still stumbled, but they always returned to each other. Always remembered that day when she mistook his car for an Uber and accidentally stepped into destiny and the world. Oh, the world couldn't get enough. Their love story became more than entertainment. It became a symbol proof that even in a world obsessed with wealth and image, true connection still mattered. People began to believe again. Women who had been hurt started to hope again. Men who had been closed off learned to open up again. And somewhere in between the headlines and viral videos, they inspired something rare, something real. And one day, as they sat on a bench overlooking a quiet lake, Dominic turned to Elena and asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd waited for the real Uber?" And she laughed that soft, full laugh and said, "I don't think I was supposed to. Because that wasn't fate, it was an invitation, an open door, and I chose to walk through it. And in that moment, it all made sense. Every twist, every fall, every misunderstanding, every tear had led them here. And the beauty of their story wasn't that it was easy. It was that they never gave up, even when it got hard. Especially when it got hard. Love had transformed them into people they never imagined they could become. And now it wasn't about survival. It was about legacy. So if you've ever been the girl who felt invisible or the man who shut the world out, if you've ever thought your pain made you unlovable or your past made you unworthy, let this be your reminder that sometimes love doesn't find us when we're ready. It finds us when we're real, broken, messy human. And that's when it matters most, because love is not a fairy tale. It's a fight. It's a choice. It's a promise that no matter how lost we are, we can always find our way back to each other, and maybe your own unexpected Uber is out there too. Your moment, your story, your someone. And when it comes, don't be afraid to step into the wrong car, because it might just take you to the right destination. And if this story touched you, reminded you of something you thought you lost, or gave you hope for something you still dream about, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs it. Let it travel further. Spark something deeper. Because in a world that's forgotten how to believe in love stories, maybe yours is the next one waiting to be written. And that's what Elena and Dominic became. Not just a couple. Not just a story. But a spark. And the world will never forget the fire they lit together.